My name is Dr. Elena Wu, and the first time my mother looked at me in 5 years, she didn't recognize me as her daughter. She recognized me as the surgeon who could keep her favorite child alive. My older sister came in on a trauma helicopter just after 3 a.m. unconscious, bleeding out, and tagged unstable. My father was in the waiting room demanding answers, voice shaking with authority he no longer had. My mother clung to his arm like he was a railing on a sinking ship. Then the OR corridor doors swung open and a nurse called out the attending on call. "Major Wu," she said, "they're ready for you." 5 years earlier, my family had decided I was dead to them. Not because I'd stolen, not because I'd hurt anyone. They cut me off over a story one my sister delivered with that careful, trembling concern that makes a lie sound like protection. She told my parents I'd been expelled from the military medical academy. In our house, expelled didn't mean paperwork. It meant character. My parents, David and Karen Wu, were decent people in the way some decent people are polished, rule-bound, loyal to appearances, because appearances felt like safety. They didn't scream. They didn't throw things. They simply closed a door and convinced themselves it was righteous. My older sister Marissa was always the one they could proudly display. 3 years older, charismatic, effortless. She could charm adults at church potlucks and make teachers feel chosen. My parents rewarded that like it was virtue. I was the other one, the quiet kid who learned early that being easy didn't earn love, it earned silence. I tried anyway. I got the grades. I stacked AP classes and volunteer hours like bricks, thinking if I built something impressive enough, they'd have to look up. Growing up, our dinners felt like auditions. Marissa performed. My parents applauded. I learned to speak only when spoken to clear plates before anyone asked to bring home report cards that could sit on the fridge without anyone having to explain them. On holidays, the pattern got sharper. At Thanksgiving, Marissa held court at the table, laughing too loud, retelling stories my parents already knew, making my father's friends call her a natural leader. I'd wash dishes with my mother and listen to her talk about Marissa's potential like it was an heirloom. So when the acceptance packet came from the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences USUHS, my father read it at the kitchen table and said slowly, "Military Medical School." That's real medicine. It wasn't warmth, exactly, but it was attention. For a few weeks, my mother told neighbors Elena's going to be a doctor, like she'd been waiting to say it her whole life. Across the table, Marissa smiled with her mouth, her eyes measured. After that, she started calling me constantly. Who were my professors? What were their names? What hospital rotations did we do? Who did I study with? I thought naively that she finally wanted a sister. I didn't realize I was feeding her ammunition. USUHS was hard in the way the military is hard, structured, unforgiving, proud of the pressure. Most of us were on scholarship, which meant our diplomas came attached to uniforms and future deployments. I survived the first year by sheer discipline, and by clinging to one person who felt like home in a city that didn't care. Her name was Rachel. Second year, Rachel collapsed in a lab. Within a day, an oncologist said the words acute leukemia, and the room went quiet in that clinical way that pretends it's neutral. Rachel didn't have family nearby. Her parents were across the country. She had me and an IV pole and the brutal calendar of chemo. I sat with her through nights that smelled like disinfectant and fear. I learned how to read lab values like weather. When her condition worsened, the dean approved a compassionate leave for me one semester as her designated caregiver. It was official, signed, filed. My seat was held. My return date was in writing. I called Marissa because some part of me still believed she could be the sister she acted like on the phone. She sounded sweet. "Oh, Lena, I'm so sorry. Do what you need to do. Don't tell Mom and Dad, they'll panic." 3 days later, my father called at 11 p.m. while I was sitting beside Rachel's bed. "Your sister told us everything," he said, voice flat. "Dad, I took an approved leave," I said. "I can send the paperwork. I can give you the dean's number." "Stop," he snapped. "Marissa showed us proof, messages, evidence." "What messages?" My mother took the phone. Her voice shook with fury. "How could you lie to us, Elena? How could you shame this family?" "I didn't." "Enough," my father said. "Don't call this house again until you're ready to tell the truth." The line went dead. A minute later, Marissa texted, "I'm sorry, Lena. I had to tell them." Over the next 5 days, I did everything a reasonable person does when the people they love choose a lie. I called 14 times. The first 3 went to voicemail. Then my number was blocked. 2 days after that, my mother blocked me too. I sent 2 emails, one short, one long. The long one included the PDF of my leave approval with the dean's signature and the registrar's seal. I attached direct phone numbers. I made it impossible to miss. I sent a handwritten letter by overnight mail. It came back unopened, returned to sender, with my mother's handwriting on the envelope like a stamp of rejection. Later, when my father accused me, I begged for a simple thing: verification. "Call the dean," I said. "Ask, please." He didn't. That's what still stings. Not that he was tricked, people get tricked. That he wouldn't lift a finger to check if his daughter was telling the truth. I tried to recruit anyone who still had a pulse of fairness. I called my Aunt Joyce, my father's sister, the one who used to slip me $10 at Christmas when nobody was looking. She called my parents and came back to me 40 minutes later, voice heavy. "He told me not to interfere," she said. "He said you made your bed." On the 6th day, I stopped calling. Not because I didn't care, because I finally understood they weren't confused. They were committed. Within a month, the lie had grown legs. Cousins stopped replying. An old family friend messaged me, "We're praying you get help." Marissa didn't just erase me. She replaced me with a version of me that made their cruelty feel justified. If I was troubled, if I'd thrown away my future, then their silence wasn't abandonment. It was discipline. That's how she built it, not one lie, but a whole architecture of them. And my parents lived inside it because it was easier than admitting they'd misjudged their own child. Rachel died that December, quiet as a monitor dimming. I was the only one in the room when her heart stopped. No call came from Iowa, no message. Nothing to suggest my family even remembered I existed. I went back to school in January. I borrowed more. I worked more. I learned to lock my grief behind my ribs and keep moving. I graduated on time. Nobody came. I married later in a small ceremony with a borrowed kind of family, my mentor from residency, a few friends, my husband's parents. I mailed an invitation to Des Moines anyway. It came back unopened. By the time I pinned on major, I had stopped checking unknown numbers for a familiar area code. I had stopped waiting for a door that was never going to open. And then, last month, the pager on my nightstand screamed at 3:07 a.m. Level 1 trauma. Motor vehicle collision near Joint Base Lewis McChord. Female mid-30s, unstable vitals, ETA 8 minutes. I dressed in 4 minutes, drove in 6, and reviewed injuries the way I always did: airway, blood, belly, pelvis, brain. At the nurse's station, I swiped to the incoming chart. Marissa Wu. Emergency contact David Wu. My father. For 2 seconds, maybe 3, I wasn't a trauma surgeon. I was the woman on a hospital floor 5 years ago listening to a dial tone and realizing love could be revoked. Then I set the tablet down, pulled on my cap, and told my team to prep or two. The helicopter blades were already thudding in the distance. And somewhere behind that sound, I knew my parents were coming, running toward a door they'd slammed shut, about to find out who was standing on the other side. The helicopter arrived at 3:19 a.m. You don't forget that sound. The blades cut the sky into something mechanical and urgent, a violence of air that means someone is losing a race against their own blood. In trauma surgery, the night has a particular texture, fluorescent lights too bright for the hour, coffee gone cold, conversations stripped down to verbs. Prep, move, clamp, cut. By the time Marissa's stretcher burst through the ER doors, my team was already in motion. 2 residents, an anesthesiologist, 3 nurses who had worked enough midnights to read catastrophe at a glance. She didn't look like my sister. That was my first disorienting thought. Her face was pale beneath the oxygen mask, hair matted with dried blood, body strapped tight to plastic and metal. Machines spoke where she could not, heart rate racing, pressure, falling numbers blinking like warnings, in a language only we seemed to understand. BP's crashing, a nurse called. 2 large bore lines, I said. My voice sounded calm, it always did. Type and cross. Activate massive transfusion. No hesitation, no tremor. 5 years earlier, my family had decided I was unstable, dishonorable. A cautionary tale whispered at holiday dinners. Now I stood at the foot of my sister's bed while an entire unit moved at the pace of my instructions. Irony doesn't announce itself, it just stands there and breathes. People imagine revenge as heat-screaming matches, shattered glass dramatic confrontations played at full volume. But exile had taught me something colder. Precision. In those 5 years without a family, my life narrowed to structure. Military medicine doesn't leave room for emotional collapse. You perform or you're replaced. You stabilize or someone dies. There were no sympathetic pauses because my parents had disowned me. There were exams, deployments, casualty simulations, 12-hour shifts that bled into 14, decisions measured in seconds. The grief I carried for Rachel for the family that vanished overnight had nowhere to go. So I did what the military trains you to do with chaos. I compartmentalized. I learned to place pain into sealed mental containers, label them, stack them neatly behind my ribs, and move forward like nothing inside me was breaking. That discipline built my career. It also built the distance between who I was and who my family believed I'd become. Fast scans positive, a resident said, snapping me back to the present. Fluid in the abdomen, blood most likely. Let's move, I replied. We rolled fast through corridors that smelled of antiseptic and sleeplessness. The operating room doors swung open like a threshold between worlds. Inside, everything was stainless steel and ritual. Anesthesia secured the airway. Nurses counted instruments. The surgical field bloomed under harsh white light. My hands moved automatically, gown gloves, sterile drape. For a moment just before incision, I looked at Marissa. Not my sister. A patient. That distinction wasn't cruelty, it was survival. While we worked, my parents arrived. I knew without being told. News travels strangely in hospitals at night, not through announcements, but through shifts in energy. A nurse's tight expression, a whisper at the desk. The subtle tension that ripples outward when personal history collides with professional duty. They were seated in surgical waiting room B. My father pacing, my mother praying. 5 years of silence, and now they sat 40 feet from me, unaware their estranged daughter was standing over the only child they believed they had left. Exile had changed them too. I glimpsed them briefly through the observation glass before surgery began. Age doesn't ask permission. It settles in quietly deeper lines, slower movements, the fragility that creeps into posture. My mother looked smaller. My father looked tired in a way I had never seen when I was growing up. He still wore authority like a reflex, but it hung looser now, less convincing under hospital lights at 4 a.m. They did not know I was here. That knowledge sat inside me like a live wire. Scalpel. The word sliced the moment cleanly in half. I cut. Blood welled instantly, dark and alarming. Suction answered. Retractors opened. Beneath skin and muscle lay the brutal truth of high-speed impact, ruptured spleen liver torn along an unforgiving line. She's bleeding fast, anesthesia warned. I see it. Clamp, pack, control. My world shrank to anatomy and consequence. Whatever Marissa had done, whatever lies she had fed our parents, none of it mattered on that table. There is a purity in surgery that most people never witness. A human body does not care about betrayal. It cares about survival. The procedure lasted 3 hours and 36 minutes. Long enough for exhaustion to creep in, long enough for memories to test the edges of my concentration. 5 years of erased birthdays. 5 years of unopened letters. 5 years of hearing through distant relatives that my parents spoke of me like a tragedy they refused to name. And now here I was stitching together the body of the woman who had orchestrated it all. At 6:55 a.m. I placed the final suture. Vitals stabilizing, bleeding controlled. Alive. Dr. Patel, who had observed silently as backup, lowered his mask slightly. Textbook work, Major. I nodded once, already stripping gloves hands moving through the choreography of completion. I'll speak to the family. Walking to the waiting room felt longer than the surgery. Hospitals at dawn are suspended between exhaustion and renewal, night staff fading, day staff arriving, coffee brewing somewhere down the hall like a promise. Inside waiting room B, my parents sat side by side. My father stood the instant I entered, reflex, habit, the old need to command a situation that no longer belonged to him. How is she, he demanded. Then he saw my face. Saw my badge. Read my name. The transformation was physical. Recognition spread through him like shock eyes, widening color, draining the terrible recalculation of a belief system collapsing in real time. My mother gripped his arm. Hard. So hard her knuckles blanched white. For 5 seconds, no one spoke. 5 seconds containing 5 years. Mr. and Mrs. Wu, I said evenly. Not Mom. Not Dad. My name is Dr. Elena Ward. I'm the attending trauma surgeon. My mother's mouth parted, but no sound came. My father stared as if language itself had abandoned him. Your daughter sustained a ruptured spleen and a grade 3 liver laceration, I continued, voice clinical steady. Surgery was successful. She is stable and currently in ICU. Silence. Then my mother whispered, broken and disbelieving. Elena. Behind me I sensed my staff watching. Hospitals are ecosystems of observation. Nurses pretend not to notice. Residents memorize everything. Wordless understanding passes between professionals who recognize when a moment carries weight beyond medicine. My father's voice finally emerged rough as gravel. You're the surgeon? I am. But Marissa said, what exactly did she say? He stopped. Because now for the first time the question demanded precision. My mother began to cry. Not theatrically, not loudly. The kind of quiet, unraveling grief that comes when reality doesn't just contradict a story, it obliterates it. We thought you were gone, she sobbed. I wasn't. You never called. I did. 14 times. 2 emails. 1 letter returned unopened. Fax I would deliver later. Not here. Not yet. I need to check on my patient, I said calmly. Professional boundary, emotional distance. My father reached out instinctively as if to stop me, then hesitated mid-air. Uncertain. For the first time in my life. In ICU, Marissa regained consciousness that afternoon. Her eyes found my badge. Confusion first. Then horror. Elena, she rasped. Yes. You're the surgeon. I was. She stared at the ceiling, breathing shallow mind racing behind pupils that had once calculated every move in our childhood home. I can explain. You will, I replied. But not to me. Because revenge, I had learned, is not about shouting. It is about timing. And the truth, after 5 years buried under lies, was finally standing at the door, waiting to be invited in. By the second day, the hospital knew. Not the details, hospitals rarely trade in gossip the way offices do, but the shape of it. Staff are experts at reading emotional weather. They noticed the unusual stillness around me, the careful neutrality of my tone, the way Dr. Patel hovered just a little closer than necessary. They noticed my parents, because my parents did not behave like typical family members. Most relatives in ICU carry fear, hope, exhaustion. Mine carried something heavier, something tinged with dawning dread. They sat for hours beside Marissa's bed like penitents, unsure what sin they were confessing. They watched me the way people watch an approaching verdict. Marissa, meanwhile, recovered quickly physically. The spleen was gone, the liver repaired, the bleeding stopped. But consciousness brought consequences no anesthesia could soften. Every time I entered the room for rounds, her eyes tracked me with a mixture of resentment and unease. Not gratitude. Never gratitude. That oddly hurt less than it should have. I had long ago stopped expecting warmth from her. On the 3rd morning, I arrived to find tension already coiled in the air. My mother stood rigid near the window. My father paced at the foot of the bed. Marissa's monitor ticked steadily, indifferent to the storm gathering inches away. You need to tell us what's going on, my father said the moment I stepped inside. No greeting. No acknowledgement of the previous 5 years. Just demand authority worn thin but still reflexive. I glanced at Marissa. She looked tired. Cornered. Elena, my mother whispered, voice trembling, please, we don't understand. I believed that. Which was the tragedy. For 5 years they had lived inside a fabricated reality, one constructed carefully by Marissa brick by brick, reinforced with selective outrage and counterfeit evidence. People imagine lies as fragile things. They are not. A lie repeated consistently, supported by emotion and protected by pride, becomes architecture, solid, habitable, difficult to dismantle without collapsing the lives built inside it. My sister had not merely lied. She had engineered belief. Not here, I said quietly. This is still a clinical environment. My father's jaw tightened. We're your parents. And she's my patient. The distinction landed like a slap. But it was necessary. We met that afternoon in a consultation room down the hall. Neutral ground, no machines, no sterile rituals to shield anyone from what was about to happen. Dr. Patel joined us at my request, not as a surgeon, but as a witness. Hospitals understand the importance of documentation when personal and professional boundaries intersect. My parents sat side by side, hands clasped tightly. They looked smaller than I remembered. Age, guilt, and fear have a way of compressing people. I'm going to speak, I began evenly, and I ask that you listen without interrupting. My father nodded stiffly. My mother wiped her eyes. For 5 years you believed I had been expelled from medical school. Yes, my father said hoarsely. Because Marissa told you. She showed us proof, he insisted weakly. What proof? He hesitated. Because now the word required precision. I slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents my parents had refused to see half a decade earlier. Official leave approval. Registrar verification. Graduation records. Military commission paperwork. Promotion orders. Every page dated, signed, authenticated. Every page quietly existing while my family erased me. My mother's hands trembled as she opened it. She read slowly, lips moving soundlessly. My father stared at the first page as if it might rearrange itself into something less catastrophic. This can't be right, he whispered. It is. But Marissa said, Yes, I replied calmly. She did. The silence that followed was suffocating. My mother began shaking her head, tears spilling freely now. Oh my God. 4 words. Heavy with realization. I called 14 times, I continued. Sent 2 emails, 1 letter. My father closed his eyes. My mother sobbed openly. You blocked my number. No accusation. Just fact. Because facts no longer required anger to wound. My mother choked, we thought you abandoned us. I nodded once. That was the story you were given. Later that evening, my aunt, the one relative who had never fully believed Marissa's version, arrived with something my parents could not ignore. Evidence. Emails saved. Voicemail logs. Screenshots of messages Marissa had sent instructing her to remain silent for the family's peace. Peace. The word tasted obscene. In Marissa's ICU room, the confrontation unfolded without my presence. I learned of it the way doctors learn most things about family drama secondhand, filtered through nurses who witnessed emotional implosions with professional discretion. Marissa cried. Of course she did. Denied malicious intent. Claimed misunderstanding. Then pivoted, as she always had, into victimhood. I was protecting you, she insisted. From what no one could say. My father's voice, I was told, broke. Not with sadness. With something closer to devastation. You told us she was unstable. She was, Marissa snapped. You said she lied. She did. You said she never called. She didn't. I blocked her number because you told me to. That ended it. Because truth has a brutal simplicity lies cannot survive. When I visited Marissa the next morning, her performance was gone. No tears. No outrage. Only a hollow stillness I had never seen in her before. You destroyed everything, she said flatly. I didn't. You humiliated me. You did that yourself. Her eyes flashed briefly, anger flickering like a dying flame. Then faded. Because for the first time in her life there was no audience left willing to believe her script. Revenge, I realized then, is rarely cinematic. No triumphant music. No dramatic speeches. Just the quiet collapse of a false reality under the unbearable weight of documented truth. My parents began therapy 2 weeks later. Not because I demanded it. Because the alternative, living with what they now understood, was unbearable. My mother cried through entire sessions confronting years of passive complicity. My father struggled more. Pride does not dissolve easily, especially in men who have built identities around being correct. But even he could no longer deny the wreckage. Marissa was discharged a month after surgery. Scar healing. Reputation in ruins. No one ostracized her explicitly. They simply stopped trusting her. For someone who had built her life on credibility, admiration, and control, That absence was punishment enough. We met once after that. A cafe halfway between her apartment and my home. Neutral territory again. She looked older, quieter. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said. "Good." A flicker of pain crossed her face. "Real this time. I just want you to know I'm trying." I studied her carefully. 5 years of damage does not evaporate over coffee. "Then prove it," I replied calmly. "With time." Because revenge had already done its work. The truth had walked in. And nothing in my sister's carefully constructed world survived its arrival. Therapy did not fix my parents. That's the first truth worth stating. In America, we've developed a comforting mythology around healing a belief that insight arrives like a switch flipping, that regret naturally produces transformation. Real therapy is slower, humbler, far less cinematic. It doesn't redeem. It dismantles. And my parents had an entire internal architecture to take apart. My mother went first. Of course she did. She had always moved toward emotional discomfort while my father retreated behind silence and stubbornness. Within weeks, she was writing letters not to me at first, but to herself. Pages of confession. Pages of things she had never allowed herself to articulate. "I chose peace over truth," she admitted in one. "I let fear of conflict become an excuse for cowardice." She sent me that letter 3 months later. I read it alone at my kitchen table, morning light sliding across hardwood floors, coffee cooling untouched beside my hand. I did not cry, but I held the pages for a very long time. My father resisted. Not therapy itself he attended dutifully, but the premise. The suggestion that his certainty, his reflexive loyalty to Marissa's narrative, might have been less about evidence and more about ego. Men like my father were raised on a particular doctrine. Be decisive, be firm, never be wrong publicly. Dr. Levinson, calm, relentless, immune to deflection, refused to accommodate that mythology. "You didn't verify," she told him bluntly. "I trusted my daughter." "You trusted the version that protected your pride." Silence. Then eventually, I thought, if Elena had really succeeded, she would have found a way back. There it was. The quiet cruelty of that logic. Success, it turned out, had been the problem. Not my absence. Not my supposed disgrace. But the unbearable dissonance between the daughter they'd dismissed and the woman I had become without them. Meanwhile, my own life continued with the strange normalcy that follows emotional catastrophe. Trauma surgery is indifferent to personal reckoning. People still arrived shattered at 2 a.m. highway collisions, domestic accidents, strokes, heart attacks. Blood still pooled, decisions still had to be made. My husband Daniel watched me navigate it all with that steady, grounded patience that had first drawn me to him. "You okay?" he'd ask gently after long days. "I'm functional," I'd reply. Which in medicine is its own category of survival. Our home became something my childhood never was. Quiet. Predictable. Safe in the unspectacular way mature love tends to be. Sunday mornings meant coffee, newspapers, our golden retriever Apollo stretched across the kitchen floor like a furry obstacle. No performances. No competitions. No one measuring worth by volume or charm. My parents visited cautiously. At first, brief encounters orchestrated with the delicacy of diplomatic negotiations. Lunches where conversation hovered politely over neutral territory, whether Daniel's work, Apollo's latest destruction of household items. They apologized. Often. But apologies, I had learned, are emotional currency easily inflated by guilt. "I'm sorry" is a beginning, not a repair. "I believe you're sorry," I told them once evenly. My mother's eyes filled instantly. My father nodded stiffly. But remorse without behavioral change is just emotional theater. They absorbed that quietly. Because for the first time they understood I would not rush to ease their discomfort. Revenge had changed shape. It was no longer about exposure. It was about boundaries. Marissa, for her part, entered therapy with visible reluctance and surprising persistence. The collapse of her credibility had been total. Friends withdrew. Professional relationships cooled. Invitations ceased arriving. Not from cruelty. From erosion of trust. For someone who had lived her entire life as the admired, reliable, socially adept daughter, that vacuum was existential. I don't know who I am without people believing me, she confessed during one session, a line later repeated to me with trembling honesty. It was the first statement I had ever heard from her that contained no manipulation. Only fear. We met monthly. Neutral cafes, structured conversations, no emotional ambushes. I was terrified, she admitted one afternoon, fingers wrapped tightly around a mug she barely touched. When you got into medical school, it felt like I was disappearing. You weren't disappearing. It felt like it. She stared at the table. I built my identity on being the successful one. When that shifted, I panicked. Not justification. Explanation. There's a difference. I can understand your fear, I said calmly. Her eyes lifted, startled. But understanding is not absolution. She nodded slowly. I know. Justice, I realized, is not the same as punishment. Punishment satisfies emotion. Justice reconstructs reality. And reconstruction is exhausting work. 6 months into my parents' therapy, my father called unexpectedly. Not for forgiveness. Not for reassurance. I spoke to the Johnsons, he said quietly. Old neighbors. People who had heard Marissa's lies years earlier. I told them the truth. A pause. I should have done that 5 years ago. Yes, I replied. No softening. Because growth that survives requires honesty without anesthesia. My mother became fiercely committed to repair. She corrected relatives, hosted small gatherings where truth replaced rumor, confronted with visible trembling the social discomfort she had spent decades avoiding. I failed my daughter, she told an aunt bluntly. No excuses, no deflections. Watching her fight through shame toward accountability was complicated, painful, and reluctantly admirable. Marissa's consequences remained largely social. No lawsuits. No dramatic exile. Just the slow, brutal recalibration of how others perceived her. Trust once fractured does not snap back. It regrows if it regrows at all, like damaged bone. Crooked. Fragile. Different. 1 year after the accident, my parents attended a hospital ceremony. Community recognition for trauma service. They sat in the last row. Unobtrusive. Silent. When my name was called, they stood with everyone else, hands trembling, faces wet with something too layered to classify neatly. Pride. Grief. Regret. Love rediscovered too late to erase damage, but not too late to exist. I did not look at them. Not from cruelty. From clarity. My life was no longer a performance seeking parental approval. It was a structure built deliberately brick by brick without dependence on their gaze. Justice is rarely loud. It is a quiet reconstruction of truth, responsibility, and boundaries. And though revenge had begun this journey, something steadier now carried it forward. Not anger. Not triumph. But the disciplined refusal to let lies define the architecture of my life ever again. People expect revenge stories to end with destruction. A dramatic severing, a final speech, a villain ruined beyond repair. Real life, I've learned, is more unsettling than that. Because sometimes justice does not demand annihilation. Sometimes it demands restraint. 2 winters passed after Marissa's accident. Seasons moved the way they always do in the Pacific Northwest, rain sliding into pale sunlight, mornings edged with frost, evenings settling early into a quiet that felt earned rather than imposed. Outwardly, my life was stable. Professionally, I had advanced. Personally, Daniel and I had built something that resembled peace, not the fragile peace of avoidance, but the steady kind that comes from emotional honesty and well-defended boundaries. And yet, there remained a particular ache that no success ever quite dissolved. Not rage, not grief. Something subtler. The phantom sensation of a family that had once erased me. My parents continued therapy. To their credit, they did not treat counseling like a temporary penance. They committed to the long, unglamorous work of examining patterns older than I was. My father's rigidity, my mother's reflexive surrender to conflict avoidance, the dangerous comfort they had found in Marissa's certainty. Change came slowly. But it came. My father learned to say I was wrong without visible physical discomfort, a sentence that would have been unimaginable in my childhood. My mother stopped apologizing for things that did not require apology, a habit she later described as a lifetime of preemptive self-erasure. Watching them evolve in their 60s was humbling and painful. Growth, after all, does not retroactively protect the child who needed it decades earlier. Marissa's transformation was less linear. Trust, once shattered, had not magically returned to her social world. Friendships remained distant. Professional relationships polite but cautious. She lived with consequences that no court could impose. A reputation permanently altered. A credibility forever conditional. But therapy had done something unexpected. It had stripped away performance. "I don't like who I was," she told me one afternoon. We sat in a cafe we had come to favor, neutral territory, sunlight diffused through tall windows, conversations unfolding without theatricality. Her voice was quieter now, measured. "I built my entire identity around being admired." She stared into her coffee. "When that became threatened, I panicked. I listened without interruption. Not coldly, not warmly, just present. I told lies because I was afraid of becoming invisible," she continued. The irony hung between us like something neither of us needed to name. "You made me invisible," I replied calmly. Tears welled instantly in her eyes. "I know. For years I had imagined this moment differently. Imagined anger erupting, accusations unleashed, a satisfying emotional detonation. Instead, what I felt was stranger. Distance. Not the bitter distance of hatred, the steady distance of someone who has already survived the worst damage. Revenge had burned itself out long ago. What remained was evaluation. "I can understand why you were afraid," I said evenly. Her head snapped up slightly, surprise flickering across her face. "But fear explains behavior, it does not excuse it." She nodded, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "I don't expect forgiveness." Good. A small wounded flinch. Then acceptance. Because forgiveness, I had learned, is not an obligation owed to remorse. It is a decision earned through sustained behavioral evidence. And sometimes, it never fully arrives. Justice without cruelty became my guiding principle. Not because Marissa deserved gentleness. Because I deserved peace. My parents visited regularly now. Not intrusively, not with entitlement. They asked before coming. They respected limits. They listened more than they spoke. One Sunday morning, my father stood awkwardly in our kitchen holding a bottle of orange juice like he needed instructions for existing there. "Can I help?" he asked. A simple sentence. Heavy with history. I studied him carefully. This man who had once blocked my number. Who had believed without verification that his younger daughter was a disgrace. Who had lived 5 years inside a lie because certainty had felt safer than inquiry. Age had softened him. Regret had reshaped him. But remorse had not erased reality. "You can set the table," I replied. He nodded immediately. Moved cautiously. Counted plates. 4. He placed them down one by one with exaggerated care as if porcelain required apology. My mother embraced me lightly beside the stove. Not the desperate, clinging embrace of guilt. A gentle, trembling contact. Real. Human. Imperfect. It was not the childhood I had deserved. But it was the truth. And truth, I had learned, was sturdier than fantasy reconciliation. The final reckoning came quietly. No dramatic confrontation. No explosive climax. Just a conversation Marissa initiated nearly 3 years after the accident. "I've spent most of my life competing with you," she said softly. We sat again at the cafe. Neutral ground. But there's something I need to say without expecting anything back. I waited. "I was jealous of you long before medical school." Her hands trembled slightly. "You were disciplined, focused, steady. Mom and Dad never praised you the way they praised me, but part of me always knew you were stronger." Silence. Raw. Unrehearsed. "I thought if you ever fully succeeded," she whispered, "there wouldn't be space left for me." There it was. The core wound beneath years of deception. Not hatred. Fear of displacement. Fear of losing identity. Fear tragically mismanaged, weaponized into cruelty. "I can't give you back the years you took from me," I said calmly. She nodded, tears flowing freely now. "I know. I can't pretend it didn't happen. I know. But..." She looked up, startled by the word. I'm willing to let the future be something different from the past. Hope flickered fragile, disbelieving. Not absolution. Possibility. Justice does not always mean revenge completed. Sometimes it means refusing to perpetuate damage. My parents aged visibly in those years. Hair thinning. Movement slower. Time leaving its quiet signatures. They carried regret with an honesty that no longer sought immediate comfort. They understood now that forgiveness is not owed on demand. That reconciliation is negotiated, not assumed. On my 40th birthday, they stood in my living room holding a cake that listed the wrong number of candles. My father squinted at it. Too many, he asked sheepishly. For once, I said dryly, not enough. We laughed. All of us. The sound unfamiliar. And real. Revenge had begun this story. Truth had detonated it. Justice had reconstructed it. And mercy, hard-earned, carefully rationed, had softened its edges without erasing its lessons. Because the deepest revenge I discovered was never humiliation. Never retaliation. Never cruelty returned in equal measure. It was this: I built a life so stable, so honest, so untouchable by lies, that I no longer needed revenge at all. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of silence, of estrangement, of truths delayed but not destroyed, I hope you'll take a moment. Reflect on it. Share your thoughts. Or pass it along to someone who may need to hear it. And if you'd like more stories like this, stories about resilience, justice, and the complicated architecture of family, you're welcome to stay. Subscribe. I'd be honored to tell you the next one.